Okay, good afternoon, good evening, or possibly even good morning to some of you, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the final session today of IIoT World on how to mitigate your ICS, IIoT, and software supply chain cybersecurity risks. First of all, it'd be great if you could just, if you feel like it in the chat, just tell us who you are, where you are from. It's always nice to get a feel for who's joining us. And while you do that, get settled in, grab a coffee, whatever it is that you need to do, I just want to go through a few bits of housekeeping. So the session is planned to last around an hour, depending on how many questions we have. Might go a little bit less than that, but let's see. And I'll be starting off by introducing the panelists, and we're then going to be discussing some of the key aspects of this software supply chain security topic. I'm sure we're going to be getting a lot of valuable insights from our guests. And we will be leaving some time at the end of the session for questions from you, the audience, obviously. And what I would like to ask you to do is to please post questions in the Q&A function rather than in the chat, just because it makes it a lot easier for us to find them. And there's more chance that we'll get to your question if you use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen there. Also, just wanted to give you a quick heads up for next year. As I'm sure most of you are aware, IoT World hosts these kinds of virtual events all throughout the year. And there are some really good ones coming up. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on what those are. In January 26th, we've got All Things IIoT Day. In March the 2nd, we've got the Energy Day. May 17th, Manufacturing Day. Industrial Metaverse Day on June the 28th. Then there's a bit of a break for the summer. We then have ICS Cybersecurity Day on September 27th, Smart Buildings Day on October the 25th, and then on December the 7th, and exactly 1 year from now, we also have the Manufacturing Supply Chain Day, just like we do today. And I don't know about you, but I'm extremely interested to see exactly where the world will be in 12 months to the day from now. And you can find all the details about all of those events as they come up on iiot-world.com/upcoming-virtual-conferences. I'm sure you all know the website anyway, but just so you all know where you can find out about those upcoming events. And finally, before I get to the speakers, I just want to say a quick word about the sponsors. Obviously, it wouldn't be possible to run this conference at all without our sponsors. So I just want to give a big shout out, a big thank you to them. Hitachi Vantara, HiveMQ, Faircom, Fortinet, Eurotech, Oxys, Building Cybersecurity, Zona, MSA, GE Digital, IFM, Intel, Litmus, and last but not least, the NCC Group. Thank you all for making this fantastic event possible. And that's me done with the housekeeping, as I'm sure you're delighted to hear. And it's time for me to introduce our speakers. So I am delighted to be joined by three of what I think we can call some of the leading lights in the industrial cybersecurity space, the ICS cybersecurity space. I'd like to start with Eric Byers, who is CTO and board member at Atlas. Eric is widely recognized as one of the world's top experts in the field of SCADA or SCADA security. We all know what SCADA means. And among many of accolades that he's built up over the years, he is the inventor of the Tofino security technology, which is probably the most widely deployed ICS-specific firewall in the world. He founded the CBIT Critical Infrastructure Security Center and shaped it into one of North America's leading academic facilities in ICS security. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's received numerous industry awards, and he's even testified to the US Congress on the security of industrial control systems in national critical infrastructures. Today, Eric spends his time providing technology and market guidance to companies entering the ICS market and also policy guidance for companies involved in the operation of critical infrastructures. So Eric, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Eric. Next, we have Bill Moore. Bill is CEO of one of our key sponsors, Zona. Zona is the frictionless user access platform purpose-built for critical infrastructure. He works with operators of that critical infrastructure and ICS cybersecurity companies to identify the most efficient ways to both reduce operational costs and cyber risks at the same time. And Bill has really seen the industry from all angles with a career that spans solution architecting, product marketing, business development, building strategic technology alliances. And he's also helped build pre-IPO tech startups into massive multi-billion-dollar public companies, some of which you will certainly have heard of: Aruba Networks, Varonis, and FireEye, for example. So Bill, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And our third panelist is another Eric Irwin, and I'm going to do my best not to confuse the two of you while we're having our discussion. As the Director of Industrial Cybersecurity at 1898 & Co., Eric is leveraging his 20+ years of experience to serve the utility and, of course, the manufacturing sector as well. Specifically, he focuses on ICS and SCADA cybersecurity, IT/OT convergence, and cybersecurity program development. He also has extensive experience in leading strategic technology initiatives focused on securing critical infrastructure, risk management, governance, and compliance implementation. And as regulation is going to be one of our topics later on, I'm sure he'll have a few words to say about that. And he also has extensive experience and expertise in program management, network operations, and physical security as well. So Eric, warm welcome to you as well.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And finally, a very quick couple of words about me. I am your moderator, Hamish Mackenzie. I'm a former IDC analyst, and I've been running my consulting practice here in Munich, Germany since 2006, where I specialize in helping global SaaS companies become uniquely valuable. And I have several companies and several clients in the cybersecurity space, so hence why I'm moderating this session. And I'm also a co-founder of a new venture called Growth Attractors, which helps pre-seed startups get clarity on their value propositions for customers, investors, employees, and strategic partners. And on top of all that, I'm also a certified Marshall Goldsmith stakeholder-centered executive coach as well. So if you want to know any more about any of those things, please just look me up on LinkedIn. That's where you'll find me, easiest to find me. But I'm sure you'll agree that's more than enough about me. So with a final reminder, if you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen rather than in the chat. And please try and keep them as short and concise as possible. And if you want to aim that question at a particular panelist, then let us know who that is, and that'll help us guide the questions to the right person. All right, so there's quite a lot to cover, obviously, for this in this issue. And I really wanted to kick off the discussion by trying to set some context about the software supply chain security topic overall. And I think for me, there are kind of two macro trends that are really shaping that context. So we've got the increasing volume, complexity, and variety of cyber threats that manufacturers are facing. But we also, as I mentioned a minute ago, we have this increasing regulatory burden as well, and new regulations coming out all the time. So Eric Byers, I wanted to start with you. So in terms of this, the rising tide of threats that manufacturers are facing, what are some of the newest threats and attack vectors that you're seeing across ICS systems in manufacturing specifically?
Well, I think the two biggest threats, or the biggest threats we're seeing right now, are coming from well-funded, experienced attackers, professional attackers, probably state-driven, that are going after industrial control systems. The two best known examples are Pipe Dream, which went after the liquefied natural gas industry, and Indestroyer 2, which went after the Ukrainian power industry. No points for guessing who's driving those, but they're a really good example of the opportunities for the bad guys by going after the supply chain. You attack one capability or one component manufacturer or one underlying supplier, and you get hundreds. Or in the case of something like SolarWinds, attack SolarWinds, get your claws into 18,000 companies. So, and we're really seeing this starting up in the ICS OT space, whether it's manufacturing or energy or pharma. And we're seeing it driven two ways. One of them is these highly sophisticated attacks like we saw in Pipe Dream that, hey, don't go after Schneider or Omron, which is what the actual public announcements say. Go after the underlying operating system, which is something called code assist, because you can just pivot. Once everybody's figured out you're going after Omron, just pivot over to one of the other 100 suppliers that use code assist runtime. The other thing that we're seeing is there's enough vulnerabilities that are coming out, like Log4j, that the attackers are saying, hey, why bother creating my own 0 days? People are not knowing to patch, say, Log4j, and we're still seeing vendors ship products with vulnerable Log4j in it a year after the fact. But let's just take advantage of these hidden vulnerabilities that people don't know are existing in their products. And so we're seeing lots and lots of exploit activity around, say, Log4j, some of it including in the OT space. So those are the two areas that I'm really seeing is this incredible opportunity for the bad guys to get an effect multiplier.
And are there, so you mentioned a few different areas there in terms of oil and gas. I think you mentioned manufacturing as well, obviously, which is our focus today. But I mean, are there any differences between those industries, or between the underlying OSs or whatever, that make one of those more vulnerable than the other?
Not from all the research I've done. It's basically we see the same operating systems, the same underlying components. You use the same, we pretty much use the same real-time operating systems across multiple sectors. A good example, of course, is code assist. I see it in the oil and gas industry. I see that underlying system in medical. I see it all over the place. So, I don't see significant differences between the sectors when it comes to what are underlying open source. And by the way, people yell, hey, it's an open source problem. No, it isn't. Code assist is not open source. Log4j is open source. It's the fact that as an industry, we reuse multiple components. We have to. It's the only way to efficiently write code today. So when you go and buy code from vendor X, you're buying code from not one vendor, but we typically see you're buying code from 60 to 100 vendors every time you buy a software package for OT.
And just because you mentioned those two avenues that they're pursuing, so the more sophisticated avenue on the first hand, and then the Log4j stuff on the other hand, are either of those more dangerous than the other, or the more successful than the other? Are there any differences there?
I think the ones that are the most dangerous are the ones that are most professionally driven, because they can lay hidden. They're more likely to stay undiscovered longer, and so far, unfortunately, those ones that are professionally driven have also been typically with the capabilities to be much more destructive. Both Indestroyer, well named, or Indestroyer 2, and Pipe Dream, less well named maybe, they're both quite destructive. They have a lot of destructive capabilities. So those sort of scare me the most. I mean, and we saw this a decade ago with Stuxnet. It was much more focused. It wasn't particularly a supply chain attack, but it was that it really introduced the possibility of destructive malware in OT for political and military purposes. So usually it's that ability to hide under the radar for a long period of time that really scares me.
Okay. All right. So in addition to those kind of attacks that you're talking about, and the fact that they're increasing in number and complexity and variety, we've also got this second macro trend, as I was talking about at the beginning, which is increasing regulation around the world. I've done a lot of work in the digital signing space, for example, where, and especially in Europe, we have all sorts of different legislation around that, and there's constant discussion about what type of digital signature is more secure than the other, and what's more valid than another one in terms of consent, all these different types of things, and the regulators are trying to kind of steer a path through this to try and help companies understand how they should be approaching that. But when it comes to our topic today, what are the regulatory pressures that you're seeing when it comes to cybersecurity and ICS, both in terms of what's going on right now, and then what's coming around the corner in the future, and what should manufacturers be preparing for in that sense?
Yeah, so I'm seeing sort of two separate but related streams of regulations. SolarWinds really drove the US government to take both OT security, and then if it hadn't done a good enough job, so did Colonial Pipeline. So we initially saw the executive order 14028 come out back a year and a half ago. And it was basically, all it could do is tell the US agencies what they had to do in order to secure their supply chain of critical systems. But it really did two things. It started to define critical systems, three things. Define critical systems. It absolutely called out OT technology. And it said, you have to have a supply chain solution and you have to have transparency into the supply chain. But it only applied to government agencies. So you'd think everybody could go back to sleep. But really what it did is it set the bar. And so, for example, we're dealing with a very, very large European manufacturer right now who's been told by a very, very large North American and European multinational food company that, hey, if it's good enough for the US government, you are going to have to supply software bill of materials, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, because we want transparency into what the places you're selling us. I mean, you think of this as like the problem we faced 100 years ago in the world where people would sell you a food product and you wouldn't know what was in it. What we're seeing now is that need to be able to, what's in, we see what's on the label, what's in the can, what's in that software. And so we're seeing, first of all, these US government regulations, but then we're seeing them spreading worldwide. We're also seeing, say, sovereign oil companies in the Middle East making exactly the same demands. We will have visibility, Mr. Supplier, with what you are shipping us. You can't just ship us something and say it's blah, blah, blah PLC. We want to know what's inside it. And then the second stage that we're starting to see, right now it's sort of driving that whole give us visibility. The second stage will be demands on the actual operators and users of these systems to actually use that to be able to do better risk management. But that's still coming. Right now, it's the visibility side of the house.
Okay, and I realize this is probably a stupid question, but is there any sign of any coordination? Given this is a global, rapidly becoming a global issue, then is there any coordination going on between authorities in the different regions?
Yeah, there is actually. For example, there's been so I sit on the CISA committee for outreach on software bill of materials. And, what's interesting is, first of all, the number of large OT vendors that are sitting in that committee as well. It's really outstanding. But we're also seeing, senior government people from other countries sitting in that committee and lots of exchange of information. So for good or bad, the US appears to be leading this. But we're seeing lots of activity, for example, from the German Standards and Security Agency, BSI, have lots of participants in this. And one of my team members, Ron Brash, was just out in Europe at a conference and listened to a very, very interesting talk from one of the EU spokesmen about how software bill of materials is going to follow the US lead in the EU over 2023. So, and I've also been working in Singapore and seeing exactly the same thing. So I think there is, while there might not be direct regulation worldwide, we don't have a, something like an IEC standard yet. What we are seeing is that the government regulatory bodies are certainly paying attention to each other and trying to map off what each other is doing, not reinvent the wheel, which is an improvement over the usual.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Eric, Erwin, I know you're involved in governance and compliance as well, as I mentioned. Do you have a perspective on this increasing regulation and how you're dealing with it in your work?
Yeah, so just to kind of tag on what Eric said, as we continue to see just this exponential growth in attacks on industrial control systems, operational technology areas, and where it impacts us, the safety and security of the functions that we rely on a daily basis, I think you're going to see continued pressure from regulatory agencies on the entities themselves to increase their robustness of their security controls. And so whether it's, power, what we saw with the Ukrainian attacks, several years ago, and the multiple water attacks that happened, just here recently even. And so we continue to see these types of attacks on critical infrastructure. We're looking at, different standards like NIST, IEC is like frameworks to use, but I think we're going to start seeing a little more progression towards mandated and enforceable sets of standards, especially on these areas, that really secure our critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So Eric was already mentioning SBOMs, which is kind of the topic that I wanted to move on to next, software bill of materials. After the NTIA defined the elements of that last year, as Eric mentioned, CISA is now kind of looking at the use cases and applications of that. So I wanted to come to you, Bill, on this if I can. How would you describe how SBOMs can help manufacturers address some of these supply chain security concerns in ICS and OT environments?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think historically there's been a lack of transparency. A lot of this is a cultural thing between the company and its suppliers, its OEMs. They sort of have a lot of control when they put these large industrial control systems in. So I think that there's been a lack of knowledge and transparency there that I think the SBOMs will help in helping them understand, and that kind of will dovetail into a lot of the new tools that are going in and that are tailored towards ICS asset management tools that are looking at all of these components. So the ability to kind of understand these assets in a deeper way is going to be beneficial, and be able to have some standardization there as well will help with the security. I think that there's also a lot of these are very different in the way that access is set up to them. So, just recently CISA put out some performance goals, and, they're kind of putting their stake in the ground in terms of OT and saying, you must have multi-factor authentication, for instance, in the OT network, right? So I think in terms of how these systems are accessed and updated and operated, has been pretty disparate, and really a lot of that control has been with the supplier, as opposed to the oversight being with the company that's actually responsible for it when it gets down to it. We have a large manufacturer we're talking to that lost their cyber insurance because they had not properly segmented their OT network from their IT network. So that's just kind of basic blocking and tackling. But I think, CISA is definitely helping in driving that, towards making it much more standardized in terms of the cybersecurity aspects of it, both from an asset management, vulnerability management, as well as secure remote operations.
Okay, and I'm kind of asking this to you as well, Bill, but either of the Erics, if you want to contribute here as well. So I mean, what I'm you're far deeper into this than this particular issue than I am. Is this more of an evolution then, rather than a kind of game-changing revolution? Would you say in terms of introducing this now?
So I'll jump in here. I think it's an evolution. And so right now within the ICS OT environments, especially on manufacturing, for example, there's a tremendous amount of digitization going on. And so we talk about IoT devices to help, run smarter and more efficient operations across the manufacturing floor. As we update those systems, those control systems, it's important to be talking to your vendor, understanding what components are part of that system. Eric, you mentioned it early on. There could be dozens and dozens of subcomponents that comprise that system. It's a very difficult thing to put an SBOM together and then to maintain that over time. And so when you're designing and having those discussions with vendors on what your new SCADA system is going to look like, start to have those conversations, because it all helps with your asset inventory, your vulnerability management process that Bill laid out there.
Yeah, I think it's an evolution as well. I mean, I think of when I started doing this, I'd ask, well, could you give us an asset inventory on our control system? And people would sort of look at me blankly. We've moved phenomenally far on that companies do have decent asset inventories and know what PLCs they're running. But I wander into lots of facilities and that asset inventory thing has things like HMI, with an IP address. or Windows HMI. Oh, no kidding. Tell me something I didn't already know.
Yeah.
So, what's more important is what's running on this. So it's just digging further into that visibility, because if you don't know what you own, you don't know how you're going to protect it. And so I think this is just a deeper dive into getting visibility into the items, whether they're devices or software or operating systems that you're trying to protect on the plant floor, and the bad guys are going to try to exploit.
Yeah, and just real quick, and just to add on, I think we've all been, a recipient of an email that says, "Hey, our system's now vulnerable to this high or critical vulnerability." If you don't have some sort of a list that you can go back and understand where your applicability is for your determination, it's hard to know where to even begin if you're susceptible to these new vulnerabilities that are out there.
I'll actually, there's an interesting story from, I listened to a presentation by the chief security officer at one of the largest US defense contractors when Log4j came out. And he said that, it's a massive manufacturing organization. And he took his entire staff, and for 2 weeks, they called vendors asking, "Where's Log4j on your products?" And for 2 weeks, vendors hummed and hawed. And I mean, that's a very inefficient use of your staff. And 2 weeks is forever in cybersecurity. That should have been done in an hour. In contrast, one of the large suppliers of software, general IT software, had a very, very good SBOM inventory already built, and they were able to determine it in 2 hours. 2 hours, 2 weeks, using all your staff, phoning vendors. Your choice. It's but I know which one I want to pick. I want to be able to respond to these things and not give my staff a Rolodex and start asking them to phone.
All right, so I'd like you to indulge me for a second. I do a lot of work in on the IT side as well as the OT side, and especially in workspace management. And maybe this is a German problem, I don't know, but there are still a lot of companies in Germany who don't have that kind of inventory transparency in their IT space. So would you say it's better or worse in the OT space from your perspective in terms of the situation right now?
Who wants to tackle that one? I will if nobody else.
Good.
I think it's terrible in IT. I mean, it's just something that's evolved. People weren't thinking about what your component transparency was 5 years ago. When I started doing what I'm doing, I felt like I was the only person even worried about this. I wasn't. There was other people, but it took me a while to find them. So it's new to the IT world and the OT world, but the OT world has a little bit of a bigger problem because we have a lot of these embedded systems. It's a lot easier generally to haul out what the components are of your Windows desktop than it is out of that controller sitting out in the plant floor. So I think we've got a harder problem to solve, but it's more critical because we get that one wrong and we can kill a few people. Right. Yes, that is life-threatening risks are certainly probably more prevalent in the OT world than they would be in your average office, I would imagine. So yeah, all right. So that's interesting from my perspective. Okay, so we've talked about obviously the threats are increasing. We know the regulatory burden is potentially increasing. We think that SBOMs are going to be helpful in terms of increasing that transparency. Let's get down to actionability, if I can call it that. So what should, and I'll open this up to all of you, what should manufacturers really be doing to start doing a better job of managing their potential vulnerabilities in their OT infrastructure and ICS? Any kind of concrete actions? Okay, so first of all, I'm going to give you the bad news. When you get an SBOM for a product, and you can look at it, we looked at products, for example, in industrial manufacturing products, and went out and searched for vulnerabilities on those products, and maybe we found 1, 2 in the National Vulnerability Database. Then we get an SBOM of the product, and one particular product, we ended up with 2,000 vulnerabilities. So I call this the vulnerability tsunami. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But the bad guys are looking at this and they're not complaining. They're thinking the tsunami is actually bringing them dinner. It's going to wash the fish up onto the beach for them. So they're pretty excited about this. Not because they're going to use the S-bombs. They can just reverse engineer anything they want. But they're realizing just how vulnerable the products are. But for the people in the field who suddenly have 2,000 vulnerabilities to deal with when they had one last year, it's going to be a mess. And the biggest thing I think the vendors can do is to start prioritizing those by two methods. One, using a standardization coming out actually initially out of driven by Germany, which is called CSAF, which is a mechanism for producing vulnerability reports in a machine-readable format, not a PDF, because reading PDFs is highly inefficient. So CSAF for reporting your vulnerabilities. And then secondly, a companion document to both CSAF vulnerability notices and SBOMs is something called VEX, which says, these are the vulnerabilities that are exploitable. I don't really care about the vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable. They're just annoying. But these are the vulnerabilities that are exploitable. And I think the manufacturers could be helping their customers prioritize what matters by clearly calling out, these are the products and these are the exploitable vulnerabilities. And even better, these are the vulnerabilities that are actually actively being exploited, and do it in a machine readable format like VEX or vulnerability exploitability exchange, so people can automate this. Because if you got 2,000 vulnerabilities, you're not going to do it by hand. It's not happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, obviously that's a huge workload. And I guess one of the potential sources of these vulnerabilities, maybe Bill, if I can come to you on this, is that manufacturers tend to work with a lot of different contractors, right? So what extra challenges does that throw up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in terms of allowing the operations of these, and bringing those into their network, one of the biggest challenges we've seen is that there's just a mismatch in the methodology for access the system. So your manufacturer, your supplier has a certain type of VPN. Maybe you use a different VPN or VDI and these types of things. And so being able to have a way of streamlining that and making it easier, but at the same time more secure, and then having that additional oversight on each manufacturer and make sure that they're kind of in their own sort of silo in how they authenticate, using multi-factor authentication and accessing that, and then being able to have logs and recordings if possible on how what they're doing and getting more data about the user analytics. There's a lot of stuff going on with asset management, microsegmentation, network segmentation, all of these, which are all good because it helps protect not only north-south but east-west. But the other component of this is the user access layer, more up at the application layer, and how these different systems, whether it's SCADA, HMIs, whatever they may be, are interacted with. So that's a big thing, is being able to level that and being able, in some cases we've seen our customers say, hey, we just want all of our OEMs to have a completely separate authentication and authorization methodology, and just take this out of ADFS, or maybe we want to have some sort of telemetry that we gain through an IDP in the IT side, but then we still want to have detailed logs and recordings from the OT access standpoint. So from that aspect, I think that really helps from the operationalizing security, cybersecurity, beyond sort of the vulnerability management that Eric mentioned.
Okay, I think Eric or Erwin, you were talking about components as well before, right? So are there any kind of extra recommendations for manufacturers in terms of specific components?
I mean, yeah, there's a few here. So whether it's on the software side, you can certainly look for that SBOM, and try to get what you can out of the vendor for that. On the hardware side, though, you can really, the negotiating stages of the project, kind of dig behind the curtain and see what are they doing, how are their environments hardened, what are they doing to lock down the environments to only those developers, only those people that need to have access, what are they doing to monitor for data leakage, and how do they secure remote access themselves. They may not be able to give you the exact protocols and technologies that they're using, but you can get a sense of their program and their level of seriousness around their development protocol. And then on the software side too, something that's starting to become a little more prevalent now is, or can you get a hash, an algorithm hash on software before it's delivered? And that way you can go somewhere and validate that code that you just downloaded or you just received, for example, matches what the vendor is expecting you to download to. So there's different things that you can do to validate and become a little more confident in the components and software that you're deploying in your environment.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd also add, some of the granularity. One of the key differences in OT versus IT is the safety and availability aspect of the systems, and being able to have site level controls, right? So somebody at the plant level, even if you have the ability to authenticate and access a system, you're not allowed to do that unless somebody at the plant level gives you access, because there could be situations where systems may be under maintenance, and that could present, a safety issue. Obviously, if somebody's trying to do something with the system, then they shouldn't they should be able to do it, even if they have the authorization to do that, right? From outside. So yeah.
Okay. And I mean, so I work with one client who's in cyber risk quantification, and in terms of helping manufacturers quantify that overall, or see that and protect themselves against and reduce that overall cyber risk exposure. Is there anything that they should be asking for from their suppliers and vendors to try and minimize that overall cyber risk?
Was that for this, Eric, or Eric Irvin?
Either, all of you really. So
Okay.
Anybody who wants to contribute to that, yeah.
Well, I think, from my perspective, one of the issues, especially with the digital transformation that's going on, is the fact that, the attack surface can be expanded in a lot of strange ways, right? And so really you need to not only segment, but you need to really isolate if there's protocols that have vulnerabilities or that could be used to attack the network. Protocols like RDP is very useful, but if it's exposed out to the internet or IT to systems that get emails, for instance, that are phished, that station, even you could have all the encryption in the world, but if you own that endpoint, now you have a methodology right on top of a vulnerable protocol and attack systems in the OT network. So really being able to reduce the attack surface is one of the things that has to be looked at very carefully, and architecturally how these systems are communicating and designed.
One of the types of attacks, or it's not really a type of attack, I guess, but the goal of an attack is ransomware, right? So people just trying to extort large volumes of cash. Are there any particular cybersecurity practices which companies can adopt in order to protect themselves against that specifically?
So
I'm going to say, go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say, no, it's just I don't think there is anything specifically around ransomware. Now we're just talking about the motivation of the attacker. Is the motivation of the attacker a criminal group that looks for cash? They're going to go do ransomware. Is it a military group like GRU out of Russia that wants to destruction of the energy grid in Ukraine? Either way, it's going to be about getting visibility into what you're operating, and then deciding what is your high risk and prioritizing. I don't think it makes a big difference on what the goal of the attacker is. for the most part.
Yeah, specific to, ransomware protections, there's certain just good practices to have. What does your backup and recovery, program look like? Do you test that? That's, you gotta have that in place.
Yeah.
There's certain solutions like whitelisting, for example. Good idea. Can it be deployed across your entire SCADA environment? Maybe, maybe not. It takes a lot of testing and fine tuning before you can do that. But there's a lot of just general practices. Training your organization, you've got to do that. I mean, there's just so many of these ransom attacks that make the front page of the paper. It's because someone got phished and they were just careless. And so I just can't overstate that. Even as simple as it is, it's important.
Okay, good. I want to go to some questions from the audience in a second. Just one last question from me, and I can't resist this because I've got two CEOs sat in front of me. I'm sure you're aware that there's the prospect of CEOs becoming personally liable for the impact of cybersecurity, successful cybersecurity attacks. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about that. Whether it's right, wrong, how worried you are about it, how worried CEOs in general should be about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly worried about it, and there's, obviously we're targeted probably more than other people are in the organization. So we have to be, I mean, everybody has to be careful in the organization, right? But the stakes are higher with us, right? So yeah, I mean, very concerned. I mean, we have things within our system within our own organization where we watch this very closely. When there seems to be a phishing attack or something happening with the company. So yeah, and I mean, cybersecurity insurance is becoming very, very big, and so obviously, even small organizations now, it really becomes a requirement whenever we're doing business. It's not just your regular insurance that you have, general liability and all of that, but now you need to have the cyber insurance as well. So.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, so let's go to a couple of questions that we've had in from members of the audience. So let's take a question from Connor Park. What do you see as the most effective way to identify these vulnerabilities like Log4j that you were talking about? Vendors may not know about them. So would you suggest a robust vulnerability scanning tool or rather pen testing?
I'll happily tackle that because that's what I do every day, all day. So in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of development of tools. My company makes a tool called Framework for Analysis and Coordinated Trust. There's other tools, tools from Microsoft. There's tools from a company called NetRise. And basically, these are tools that build out software bill of materials and then go looking for vulnerabilities associated with that software bill of materials. Happy path is when the vendors have pre-done that for you and you don't have to do it on every individual company's, every individual basis. And we're seeing companies doing that. Caterpillar's doing that. People like Hitachi are working on that. Companies, really good example is OSIsoft, which I'm sure lots of you guys out there in this audience use. They've, for the last 4 years, have been pre-analyzing all their code and then making that public to any of their customers on if you're using this product, here's the vulnerabilities, here's the software bill of materials, so it's really inefficient, I think, for every company to do their own pen tests. And really my vision going forward, and I think the industry vision is, can we do this as a collective community? That doesn't mean that everybody sees everybody's dirty laundry, but if you've got a need to know, like you're a customer, then you can go in and look at the OSIsoft products and actually look at a specific product you use and say, these are the components, these are the vulnerabilities, and these are the vulnerabilities that are exploitable and are currently being exploited by the bad guys out there. Yeah, there's already a whole family of products out there that will make this highly efficient for the OT market.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add on to that, yeah, I'm always in favor of having the clients themselves, the entities, have a vulnerability management program using a variety of tools that are out there, and then leveraging a third party in most cases to come in on an annual basis, for example, or a specific use case and actually pen test those environments.
Yeah.
Get that third party review.
Yeah. And I think, what we're going to see going forward is that we need to have that visibility so that informs the pen testing. Otherwise, pen testing can be, if you're just totally doing a black box pen test, I think, Eric, you'd agree with me, it is super inefficient. If you like spending money, it's a hell of a good way to do it.
We do not recommend that.
No, you
just like
really
you said,
want an informed gray box or white box pen test, and that means knowing what's inside your targets.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that. So now we have a question from Sarah Blackman. As a critical infrastructure and civil engineering team, what should we be trained? What certified skills do we need to start with? Do you have a team competency matrix?
Well, I mean, SANS has the GICSB, program from a general, cybersecurity for industrial control systems. I mean, I think there's, other skills, training skills there too. I don't know, Eric's, if you have any thoughts on that. Yeah.
I think you nailed it, Bill. Probably SANS is probably the best training skills in general for OT cybersecurity. There's particular private individuals. I'll call out Joel Langle, who does a brilliant training program if you want to dig in deep, out of the University of Texas, I think it is. Somewhere in Texas anyway, it's based out of. But if you want specifically on supply chain management in OT, then I think that's still an evolving field, and you're best off attending some of the CISA meetings or the Idaho National Lab meetings or industry-specific meetings, because that's still an evolving process.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to it. You certainly you've got SANS, but you've got IEC 62443 training out there. That's an internationally recognized set of standards, but you also have things like the CIS control, like the top 18, for a civil engineering team. I think would be great if they understood, what was behind those 18 controls and why they're needed, and leave it, and then partner with your security team to assess, your maturity in that, in how you're designing things. So there's a lot of different frameworks you can use, but just be familiar with the control family and what their intent is and what they're trying to secure and how they're going to go about that.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so we've still got another couple of questions to get through, but we've got kind of 10 minutes-ish to go. So if you haven't asked your question yet, there is still time. So please feel free to get something into the Q&A function at the bottom. I'm going to move on to Trip Braden, who says that, excuse me, get my screen back here, sorry.
Oh, something happened there.
Yeah.
It's a cyber attack.
I think we're all still here, and I can see I can see the questions again now, so hopefully you're all still there. So Trip Braden says, with many of these, Braden or Braden, I hope I got that pronunciation right, with many of these issues, there seem to be duplication of efforts on how to keep the supply chain secure. Which regulatory or government groups are really going to help shape this discussion if that duplication carries on?
I'm happy to jump in on there.
Who should be taking charge, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I think in the US, it's getting way better in cybersecurity in general. CISA under DHS is definitely in the supply chain side of the house managing that now. It was chaos for a while, but it's definitely, they're driving the message. But then there's the vertical focus. So for example, right now, DOE and FERC are running a supply chain meeting as we speak right now in Washington. But they're sort of more focusing on taking the CISA efforts and then making it work for the grid companies. I'm seeing exactly the same thing in the medical industry. The FDA in the US is being sector specific, but the directions are coming out of CISA. In Europe, I'm seeing probably the leading organization driving it in Europe right now is BSI out of Germany. So we're seeing the government agencies really step in. Same with Singapore, CSA in Singapore is driving it. Japan, I'm trying to remember the acronym, but it's usually a government agency responsible for critical infrastructure security overall that's driving these. Those are the meetings I show up in. That's where I see the best results from.
Okay. Bill, Eric, anything to add on that?
No, I think Eric covered it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so, yeah.
All right, and then we have a question from, and I apologize profusely if I get this wrong, Taz Chikwakwata, who asks, which is the best management system framework to consider for managing, mitigating, well, what we've been talking about, ICS OT cybersecurity risks. So best management system framework.
So I'm always a fan of IEC ISA 62443.
Yeah.
It's an internationally recognized, approved set of standards. It can be equated to NIST if you're more familiar with NIST, but as an international set of standards, I really favor the 62443 framework.
I'll second that. I think it's much more focused and really designed by people who are actually in the trenches when it was created for OT, ICS, SCADA, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a really good standard.
Yeah, and I think it's good to kind of look at all of them though, and just kind of map them out. You know, if you're in the, say, the power gen industry, you know, NERC SIP, but or you know, government is 800-53. But yeah, I think it's good to kind of look at those standards and just see, you know, to where they all kind of map together, because there is some overlap, and it's just good to understand that.
If I had to pick another one, look at, you know, the question I think specifically was around frameworks too. You know, look at the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm not always a big fan of some of the stuff that NIST produces, but I think the framework overall gives you directions on what you need to consider. Doesn't tell you how to get there, but it tells you what you need to consider. But then go to 62443 for what you actually have to get done.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So and I just got a message from Taz to say that I did pronounce that perfectly, apparently. So I'm very pleased about that. Is there anything we've had our questions? Is there anything else, guys, that you think we haven't covered, which we should mention on this topic? We've covered a lot of ground. So you know, if there's one thing that you think people should take away from everything we've discussed, what would that be if you can narrow it down? If I just go around the room. So Bill, you first.
Yeah, I think really making sure that you understand. Obviously the visibility is key, right? And we've come a long ways with that, and understanding all of your systems, and then obviously getting down to those component levels with the SBOMs is the first thing, right? You need to understand what you have in order to protect it and how everything is communicating. So, you know, step one is that, and then really making sure you're not inadvertently expanding your attack surface by going through this digital transformation that everybody's going through right now. So those are the two things that I would say look at first. Yeah.
Okay, great. Eric, Eric Byers, I mean, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I would echo what Bill says. You know, it's absolutely critical to get visibility, and the only way you're going to do that is with something like software bill of materials. But the second thing I'd also add to that is that it's really, really important that the industry starts working together, that this is not something that we should be doing on an individual basis. We really need to, you know, basically cooperate with the vendors, with with the other members of the industry. There's no reason for every single company to have to find the vulnerabilities themselves. That this really needs to be something that we work as a community on. And I think thanks to the work by NTIA, we've got the standards in place now. We've got the basics, the building blocks to go from. So it's not a matter of waiting. I think we can actually start moving forward.
Perfect. And Eric Owen, to finish off.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with anything Bill and Eric said. I might just add, there's different platforms out there that really facilitate information sharing on the OT ICS side of things. And so whether that's Dragos Neighborhood Keeper or the Industrial Cybersecurity Coalition, there are different tools and subscriptions that you can apply to and really leverage to help understand what your neighbors are seeing and how they're responding. And then you can play into that as well, and have that collective information and collectively raise the bar.
Yeah, and I'll say join your local ISAC, whatever you're in. There's a manufacturing ISAC now as well.
Great. All right, thank you. So I think we're gonna wrap this up. We've got just 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple of more things to say. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, Bill, Eric. Thank you so much for participating. It's been a pleasure for me. I think you've provided some important insights about these topics, which are I think we can all agree they're only going to get more important as time goes on. So thank you again. I want to say thank you again to our sponsors. Hitachi Vantara, HiveMQ, Faircom, Fortinet, Eurotech, Oxys, Building Cybersecurity, Zona, of course, MSA, GE Digital, IFM, Intel, Litmus, and the NCC Group. We do really depend on sponsors to create these amazing events, so thank you. Thank you also, of course, to our attendees. Some great questions you gave us, and I hope we were able to provide some additional insight there at the end. And don't forget, the event is not over. That is the last session for today, but tomorrow we have a lot more coming. So tomorrow we have start at 8:45 Eastern. The first session will be on the smart factory. The second session will be accelerating time to value, getting more from your software investment. We then have a session on how to make data make sense in 2023, which sounds interesting, and a session on building cybersecurity for the nation to finish off. And the event will finish at 1:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. So that's it for today. Thank you very much.